Hey, it's Mark from Power BI at Work. Thanks for joining another video. And in this video, we are going to have fun with a DAX riddle that I learned from Alberto Ferrari years ago at a conference. And by riddle and for fun, what I mean is this is definitely not an example that we want to take to work. But it is instructive when it comes to understanding context transition, iterating, and steps in calculate. So what that riddle entailed was a SUMX expression that filtered over a table, but not the entire table, just a subset of rows in this table. And so in this expression, what we want to do is iterate over this little sample table, and we want to filter down to just the rows where the quantity purchased is greater than 1. And then as a result of the expression side of this, we want to see what the grand total of those rows are in our report visual right here. So let's replicate that DAX that you see right in the middle of the screen. We're going to create a SUMX because we're going to iterate over that small table. And my table is called my table. And before I get too carried away, I want to filter this down to just the rows that I want, which are quantity greater than 1. All right. That's the table side of SUMX. The second argument is an expression, or the math side. And in this example, this riddle, okay, for fun, we used a sum over the amount. And I'm pointing out that this is just a sample or just an example, because some might already look at this and think, wow, there's something wrong there. All right, but we're going to hit enter, and we're going to look at the result and see that part of the answer is correct, but we've got this unexpected total down here at the bottom of 28. And I remember Alberto sharing this and saying, I bet you won't believe what the result is going to be in this measure. And he was right. When I watched him do this, I looked at this expression right here and knew there was something off with it. And we're going to learn it in a second what that is. But when I tried to predict what the total was going to be, what I did was I looked over here at this filtered table, and I considered from that table the rows that were going to survive. And I looked over here and thought, well, if we're going to sum over this table and we're in row context, I think that the most that we could get is a total of these two rows that are filtered. I think we're going to get 8. And I think because this table returns 2 rows, I think the most we're going to get in this result right here is 8 iterated twice. So 8 times 2, 16. I was surprised to see that even with this filtered table, that we were getting a completely unfiltered sum of the entire table iterated over these 2 rows here that you see right there. So what were my takeaways from this? I kind of sat on this example for a while, and I eventually started using this to share with others about some of the gotchas or pitfalls of using a SUMX. But here's some of the takeaways that I learned, especially with going through the steps of calculate like we've been going through. So the first one is, I think that it tricked my mind to see that we were using a filter table argument here to reduce this table down to just these 2 rows. I think somewhere in my subconscious, I felt like we were generating filter context here, when in fact we were not. Filter is an iterator that generates a table, but it just basically hides rows in our table. So it is not creating a filter for use in filter context, but is just creating a subset of rows as a table result. The next one is that I realized that the sum here, and again, not best practice, but it's what we're using for this example. I think a novice or a newbie would look at this and think, well, we want to sum these two rows right there. And if I sum them, I should get 8 as a result right there. Well, because we're using SUMX, we've got row context. And if you know about row context and what happens when you use an aggregation under a row context environment, you're going to get an unfiltered total. And so that's why we're getting an inflated total. But still surprised that with 2 rows being filtered that we're not getting something closer to 16, but we're getting 28. And that leads me to my last insight here, and it's that whenever you see a comma, and I just move the comma, which is anytime you see this comma, I consider this like a wall between filter arguments. So even in calculate, you can have multiple filter arguments. You can have different modifier arguments in calculate. I always look for this comma and treat it as a barrier between those different filter or table arguments. And the reason why I do that is because I need to remember that each one of these arguments gets evaluated under the current filter context. Regardless of what table is produced here, I need to know that this comma right here means that this SUMX is not going to be evaluated under this filtered table, but it is going to be evaluated under current filter context. So in the absence of filter context, this is going to evaluate under all of the rows in our table, which is why on this side of the SUMX function, we're getting 14. So we get 14 there. How the iterator works is that for every row that is generated in the table argument, this expression is going to evaluate for each and every row produced by this table. So here we're getting a total of the entire table, 14, and it's iterated twice for each row that survived this table expression, and that's why we're getting 28. Let's go back to our calculate steps and put this in perspective a little bit. Because we did not have in that grand total field a filter context coming from the canvas. And what I mean is you come over here and you look at this, there are no filters down here in the grand total that are generating a filter context. There are up here, which is why we're getting the filtered result for that order and this order right there. But when it comes to the grand total and you've got no orders filtering, that's why you're going to get no filter context there. And that makes sense when we look at level 1 filters here. We're looking for filters coming from the canvas, and we just simply don't have them in that grand total result. But in this example, what we could do is introduce step 2 filters when it comes to generating context transition. And if we remember, when we have a calculate present in our expression, it's first going to look for canvas filters in that grand total. But if it doesn't find them, we still have an opportunity to create calculate around that expression and allow DAX to go query and filter those rows being iterated as equivalent filter context. So that means in this riddle, this puzzle, that we should be able to come back to our measure right here and just wrap this in a calculate. And I keep saying that calculate wakes up in whatever environment it's in, and it pulls in the labels from its current environment. And in this current environment, we're in a row context and we've got these two rows right here. So what calculate is doing is it's waking up, it sees these two rows, and it pulls in each of the columns and uses each of the columns as filters over this table. So even though we're not in an order right here and we're in a grand total and there's no canvas filters, context transition, step 2, is generating its own filters over this table. And that's why now when it iterates over those two rows, we get the correct total of 8. So little fun with that example. Thankful that I learned that a few years ago from Alberto. It definitely made me scratch my head there for a second when I learned about it, and it's taken time. It's taken time for me to fully understand each step of calculate, to fully appreciate what's going on in this example. Well, thanks for watching. Please leave a comment if you've got thoughts on this example, or if you have ideas for other videos. I'd love to hear them. And otherwise, thanks for watching. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you next time. All right, see ya.